Today I have for you Bernhard Busch from Telstra. He's been leading the global internet strategy of Telstra since 2018 and also is on the board of M6 since 2019, currently acting as a chairman. And today he will enlighten us about the Asian internet and its specialties. Enjoy the talk.
Thank you. Good morning. Nice to see you all here, and it's nice to be at DENOG. It's my first DENOG. Nice to be back in Germany. I'm originally from Munich, so it's kind of unusual for me to be this far north of the Weißwurst equator. But it's definitely good to see you all here. So what I want to talk to you about really is the Asian internet. So you might ask yourself, what is a big white guy like me going to tell you about the Asian internet? So I have been working in Asia for over 25 years. I lived in Hong Kong for about 4 years in the early 2000s. Started building the internet backbones of some of the American companies at that time. And then since then I've been at Telstra building up our business. So if we can just go to the next slide. I think we can jump. Is this, I can do this from here, can I? Sorry. Yeah, good. Okay, so I think we've covered my background. So yeah, basically I've worked on the Asian internet for about 25 years. Even though I'm based here in Europe, my focus has always been Asia. So Telstra, about a 50 terabit backbone, mainly focused on the Asia-Pacific region, but we do connect into Europe, including Frankfurt and US. So, talking here, really just the kind of framing this up. Some of you may be in the tech sector. Some of you may be doing SD-WAN, building SD-WAN networks for customers using internet. This is really applying to you, and it's trying to kind of show you some of the differences that I see between the European market and Asian. So if you're doing kind of a typical tech rollout, I guess you'll be putting nodes around different parts of Europe, possibly one or many, and then each of those nodes will be covering a particular region, and you're trying to get best latency to eyeballs. Or else, if it's an SD-WAN deployment, you'll have various IP ports that you're trying to connect together in the most efficient way. So that's basically the framing of it. So let's look at how internet can apply in Europe, and what I see, from looking at it from an outside perspective, from someone who's mainly focused on Asia. So, so for me, looking at Europe from an Asian perspective, it looks kind of, I'm sure it's complicated, right? But it looks, for us, relatively simple in terms of the distances between any 2 points in Western Europe, at least, are relatively short. You've got typically less than 1,000 kilometers, so 10 milliseconds of RTD. Plentiful cheap capacity. It's definitely not as cheap in Asia Pacific, as I'll explain later. Mainly terrestrial routes. That's, I think, important because from a reliability perspective, if you have outages, they're going to be fairly short duration. That's, again, something that's different in Asia Pacific. And kind of pretty helpful, I think, is a very homogeneous regulatory environment across, at least, across pretty much all of Europe, which makes it, you kind of got a fairly even playing field. And because of that, I think you've now got a multitude of interconnection points. IX is built up around Europe, and a lot of the SASE and cloud providers are already deployed. So we've certainly found Europe to be from an internet perspective, you can get, we found extremely good performance. We run some media applications across Europe where performance is critical, and we found it to be extremely high performance. So let's compare that with Asia Pacific. And here, so Asia Pacific region, the first point is that you've got these, it's generally quite highly regulated environment, but there are deregulated connectivity, what I call connectivity islands. So the Japanese market is relatively open for most of us to operate in. Hong Kong, even though it's part of China, has a actually pretty open regulatory environment, low cost of bandwidth within the country. Obviously, many Western companies have kind of pulled back a little bit from Hong Kong in recent years, but it still has a very open regulatory environment, actually. And then Singapore, which has now pretty much turned into the major hub in Asia, I would say. It's primarily because it's kind of so central, because you've got, from Singapore, you can get down to Australia in about 100 milliseconds, up to Japan in about 70, 80 milliseconds. So you're about as central as you can be. The other thing, because you have these connectivity islands, as I call them, generally most of the interconnections between countries are done on submarine cables. And submarine cables, kind of interesting way of running capacity, but they have different characteristics in terms of your outage spectrum, right? Because the problem is that if it fails, it's going to fail for at least a month whilst the boat gets out. And if it fails in certain waters, so waters controlled by a particular country, it may take a long time to get permits. So in some cases, permits have taken up to 3-4 months to get, even to allow the cable ship to go out and repair a cable. So you have to build in a lot of diversity in Asia Pacific, because your submarine capacity can be out for quite considerable periods of time. So you don't get probably the number of outages that you get on terrestrial, but the outage duration is much longer. So you have to kind of build that into your thinking in terms of building the network. The other thing, and this kind of, when I moved to Asia, this was something that really kind of got me, was, this all looks kind of pretty small on a map, but the reality is that the distances are vast, right? So, the cable route from Hong Kong to Tokyo is, depending on which fiber route you use, you're looking at minimum about 40 milliseconds, and up to 50 milliseconds, depending on, and that's just to Tokyo, right? So if you're going to go to Hokkaido or somewhere like that, it's going to be significantly longer than that. Singapore to Australia, about 90 to 100 milliseconds. Well, to Sydney, that is. So you've got to remember that Australia, the population is very much skewed towards the eastern side of Australia. So out of 25 million people living in Australia, at least 15 to 20 are on the west, on the east side of the country. Perth only has a couple of million people. The whole of Western Australia only has like 1 or 2 million. So you're talking 100 milliseconds to Australia, plus another 30 to get to New Zealand. So the distances are vast. It's further to go from Melbourne to Tokyo than from London to LA. Just kind of distances, right? Kind of difficult to imagine. So the distances are much bigger, and there's also a high risk of tectonic activity, right? So I've marked on the map the main tectonic plate boundaries that are important in kind of that gray color here. So you can see that there's tectonic plate boundaries going right through the middle of this zone. And you get quite regular earthquakes or submarine disturbances which cause cable cuts. So you can't, that's why I'm saying it's important. And then you've also got, because of the Pacific Ocean, massive risk of typhoons in the latter half of the year, typically, as the temperature builds up in the Pacific, and you get storms coming into especially the Philippines, Hong Kong, Hong Kong, Philippines, South China, that kind of area, Taiwan, very common to have typhoons. And obviously, when there's a typhoon, you can't send a ship out to fix a cable because too windy. And then finally, you've got pretty complicated geopolitics. So there's no EU to kind of give you an overall regulatory environment. Many of these markets are quite difficult from a regulatory perspective. Even they might seem on the surface to be easy, but it's kind of complicated once you get inside, right? India, very highly regulated. China, obviously, pretty highly regulated, very highly regulated. And then you get these connectivity islands. So makes things a little bit more complicated, but also interesting, in my view. So the other thing I think worth, this is just, I put this in really to when, enterprise purchasers may be sometimes looking to buy just the cheap internet. And you've got to remember that, internet, especially in Asia, most of the peering managers and ISPs are, when they're looking at internet, it's mainly a residential product. So their first focus is building an internet for their residential users. So it's connectivity to Facebook and Google and, typical Netflix, that kind of stuff. They're not so concerned about, is the path taking the best path around? And so if you are building a network based on where you've got to control latency or RTD between nodes, you need to be quite careful what combination of ISPs you put together to build your network. Most of the ISPs locally, they'll be connected to AWS and Microsoft. There are quite a few of those Microsoft, AWS, Google cloud zones across Asia. You can see them. So that's not the issue. The issue is getting from one country to another in the most efficient and shortest path. Then the other thing worth mentioning, I think, which is kind of important in Asia, is that so basically pre-2000 to 2010, most of the Asian countries basically bought their transit on the West Coast or in the US. So and that, to be honest, a lot of that still maintains today, right? So certainly the Chinese carriers connect in the US quite extensively, but also some of the larger Japanese carriers, Taiwanese carriers, even Singtel buy a lot of transit in the US. We do as well buy transit in the US. So Telstra being Australia. So you can easily get routes which go between one country and another, or even between a POP in one country and the carrier that goes to the US and back. So you need to be watching out for any of these kind of routes that going, in principle, it should only be a couple of milliseconds, was actually going to the US and back. That happens quite a lot in Asia, more than probably in Europe. I mean, in Europe, I guess you're seeing some of that now that you've got some of these peering disputes between Cogent and TT and others, right? But in Asia, that's kind of probably more common than you might expect. In terms of the traffic patterns, so basically, based on these connectivity islands, the islands tend to be the hubs in Asia, okay? So your ISPs in Thailand, in Malaysia, in Indonesia are buying their transit in Singapore. So traffic from those countries generally tends to hub into Singapore. In fact, Singapore is becoming a really important hub simply because you've got Southeast Asia coming to Singapore, you've got India also connecting into Singapore, you've got Pakistan, and even the Middle East increasingly connecting also to Singapore because, as we've seen, there's been quite a lot of cable breaks between the Middle East and Europe in the Red Sea. And so, and actually, interestingly, the Gulf region at least, is closer from an RTD perspective to Singapore than it is to Europe. So RTD from Dubai to Singapore is about 80 milliseconds compared to something like about 120 to Europe, right? So, so we're seeing quite a lot of content being drawn from Singapore increasingly, as opposed to coming from Europe, even for the Middle East. You might not expect that. And then even Australia tends to connect into Singapore because it's the closest kind of land in terms of to that region. So so when you're doing your design, so the obvious hubs will be Hong Kong, Singapore, and Tokyo, but then you've also got to remember that which carriers are connected to the different local ISPs in those markets. So carrier selection in those different locations is important, I'd say. So yeah, but to say these days now, most of the cloud providers are yes, definitely Hong Kong, Singapore, Tokyo completely covered. They're even increasingly building cloud zones into Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia. Also, although Indonesia has a very complicated and rather restrictive regulatory environment, which is blocking investment in that market at the moment, to be honest. So that's kind of, so yeah, hopefully that helps you in terms of design, but basically you need to remember that those are the key hubs, of which Singapore is the biggest. So most people, if they're coming to Asia, the first place they go to is Singapore, typically. So other considerations when you're thinking about building in Asia. So access to China, obviously inside China being inside the firewall. From a Chinese government perspective, all that traffic has to go through one of the 3 Cs. And so the most non-Chinese carriers getting into China, that direct route is kind of expensive. So the default route for traffic to go even from Hong Kong into China is to go via the US and back into China. There are other routes, but they're generally expensive. Okay, so you need to bear that in mind. And I'll talk a little bit more. I've got a specific section on China, which I want to cover a bit in a little bit. So I'll cover more detail because Telstra actually has a network inside the Chinese firewall as well. So first of all, secondly, as I said, you've got these indirect routes. So sometimes if you're going, you need to check do some ping tests and stuff like that before you build to make sure you don't get these indirect routes via the US. And also, just to be aware that because of the hubbing, generally, you might think that Malaysia and Thailand would connect to each other. They do a bit, but mainly the traffic's going via Singapore. So don't be surprised if traffic is going Singapore and then back if it's going Thailand to Malaysia. So basically, it's kind of the Asian internet's been pretty well built out in terms of SASE and cloud. Second-tier countries tend to connect through one of the hubs, and you've also, got some of the routes back to Europe sometimes can go via the US if you're not careful. So be careful of that. So before I close, I just wanted to add a little bit on China. So we have a network inside China, and we've got quite a bit of experience in that market. So I wanted to just finally share a few things with you on that. I don't want to go through too much. We've got about 60 POPs across the region, but so our experience goes back to about 2006 when we first implemented in China. So just as a starting point, the first thing is that the three major incumbents in China, telecom, Unicom, and mobile, as you probably know, they were split back in the early 2000s. The Chinese government split into three. So China Unicom is mainly north of Shanghai. So all the region of China north of Shanghai is more covered by China Unicom. China Telecom more in the south. And then China Mobile, which at the time of the split was mainly just GSM, so not much data. Obviously, since then, data has become important, and China Mobile has built out a pretty big data network across China, so they have been probably the most aggressive of the three in terms of outside. But the other kind of thing about those three China networks that's kind of unusual is that there's not a hell of a lot of peering. Certainly what we've noticed is the peering between the three networks is kind of somewhat limited. So getting between one network and another is not always that easy, right? So you have to be mindful that China Telecom will give you good connectivity to China Telecom, obviously, but not the other, not so good to the other two. So in terms of the Great Firewall, as it's known, that's mainly implemented in three locations, three kind of access points. Shanghai, kind of pointing towards the US, Beijing kind of going more towards Japan, and then Guangzhou, which is kind of the portal into Hong Kong. So all of the traffic coming into China from an internet perspective will be going through one of those three hubs to get into the rest of China, because that's where the kind of firewall infrastructure is. And obviously that firewall is kind of doing a certain level of deep packet inspection, which can add a little bit of latency across the border. Okay. So that's the basics on that. So at the moment, the carrier kind of neutral DCs like Equinix that you may be used to in other regions, not that easy to come by. And then if you're putting any content in China, you can't easily take IP addresses that you may own, even AppNIC ones, and get them into China. The process to get them approved is quite lengthy. I mean, some of the Chinese carriers will certainly help you, but obviously then remember that if you've done that with China Telecom, for instance, you may not have great connectivity to China Unicom and China Mobile. So what we find is sometimes, certainly our network, which is connected to all three of them inside China, we provide some kind of gateway features that allow you to connect to multiple players at once. So yeah, and from within China, obviously performance to international content is variable, I'd say, noting that the government is fairly open in terms of access to business applications, Amazon, Microsoft, etc. But anything like Google or Facebook is going to be problematic, right? Yeah, just bear that in mind. So that's really all I wanted to say. Ready to open it up to questions. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. So as we said, we do have some time for questions. Do I see any questions in the room? Please raise your hand. There's one question.
I do. Hi, thanks for the talk. It was very impressive. Given that Hong Kong has transitioned to China, have you seen a move in importance towards other locations like Singapore or Tokyo maybe?
Yeah, look, absolutely. Hong Kong has definitely reduced I mean, actually, it's kind of interesting. So about 2 years ago, there was a big exodus from Hong Kong, right? Because people were kind of afraid. But actually, Hong Kong is actually from an internet perspective, it's pretty open. Hong Kong issues much less internet takedown notices than Singapore does, actually, weirdly. But obviously, people are kind of scared of maybe having some of their technology being looked at or whatever by the Chinese. And so they've been a little bit reticent. But what I'm seeing is actually a little bit of return. So maybe not critical applications coming back into Hong Kong, but certainly because it's such an important hub point, you know, it's a connect. If you want to connect to Taiwan, if you want to connect even to northern Vietnam, Hanoi, and even the Philippines connects quite extensively to Hong Kong as well. So Hong Kong is still a major hub, and it's not inside the firewall, right? So Hong Kong is definitely outside the firewall. There is no doubt. So it is still an important part of the internet, and I think it's kind of certainly coming back a little bit, but not to the same extent as it was maybe 5-10 years ago, right? Yeah.
Any other questions? I see one more question. Please state your name and affiliation before posing a question.
Steffen Zierke, DB Fernverkehr. Thank you very much for the insights. Would you mind leaving some words about the connectivity of, let's call them, politically interesting countries like Myanmar or North Korea?
Yeah, okay. So look, Myanmar, kind of interesting, actually surprisingly well connected to Singapore. There's also increasingly a secondary hub building up in Thailand, which is a relatively open market. So where there's a lot of AI investment. So Malaysia and Thailand are drawing quite a lot of AI investment because there's quite a lot of electricity available and it's like somewhat availability of land. And Singapore, because of, you know, it's restricted in terms of size, is becoming full of data centers. There's just not enough power there. So Myanmar also can hub into Thailand, but most of the Myanmar providers also connect into Singapore. So that one's kind of easy. North Korea mostly connects via China, as far as I can see. Yeah, there's nothing across the border into Korea, so into South Korea. But it's mainly connected to China, as far as we can see. And that may be one of the reasons why one of the big sources of DDoS attacks is coming from China, actually. So yeah, from China, we're seeing quite a lot of DDoS activity coming out. So yeah, combination, not sure exactly where it's coming from, but you know, obviously North Koreans have a reputation for being at the origin of some of them. Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions in the room? There is another raised hand. Again, state your name and affiliation, please.
Hi, Marco Hegenberg, RWE Renewables. So you mentioned the challenging regulations in Asia Pacific.
Yeah.
Do you see any, let's say, any effort to change this and to harmonize the legislation?
Look, I mean, some of the ASEAN countries have kind of talked about it, but the reality is, so typically in most of these markets, the incumbent carriers still have quite a lot of power with the regulator. Obviously, incumbent carriers often trying to protect their markets. You know, we've seen that everywhere. And I'm not pointing any fingers at anyone because we, Telstra, also try and protect our markets. So I can't tell anyone else the same. So look, I haven't seen any harmonization. I don't see it happening, quite honestly, because there's just too much divergence. And so, for instance, the Indian government very strongly wants to protect their market against Chinese influence, against other influences. So they kind of very strongly regulate. And maybe a little bit of harmonization across the ASEAN markets, where they've got something kind of approaching the EU, but not really quite. So it's kind of very light touch, kind of, but I don't really see it getting anywhere near what we've got in Europe. Yeah. Too much geopolitics, I'm afraid.
Okay, any more questions? If not, then again, Bernhard, thank you for the talk.
Thank you.